The king collapsed in the middle of a training yard, not from a sword, not from exhaustion, but from the absence of a woman he didn't even know existed. For 6 years, Maren Ashveil had lived 3 floors beneath him, cataloging his wars, filing his treaties, memorizing the exact weight of his footsteps in the corridor above her ceiling. She had loved him in perfect silence. She had resigned in perfect silence. And when she disappeared into the dark on the night of his betrothal announcement, the bond she left behind began to unravel him, slowly, precisely, the way a document disintegrates when the binding thread is pulled. The chancellor tracked her down in 6 days. He placed the truth on the table between them like a blade. Come back, or the king dies. She came back, but not to save him. She came back to make him choose. So why, on the night she finally told him everything, did he cross the room without a single word? Follow along as we unravel the story of the woman who kept a kingdom's secrets, and the one secret she could never file away. The great hall of Castle Duverne smelled of pine resin and burning tallow, the way it always did when the king wanted something to feel important. Maren Ashveil had learned to read the castle by its smells alone. Pine and tallow meant ceremony. Wet iron meant soldiers back from the field. Damp wool and old bread meant the outer villages had sent petitions again, crowding the lower courtyard with their worn boots and their careful voices. Tonight was pine and tallow. She had rehearsed this for 3 days, spoken the words to stone walls in a whisper, mouthed them in the dark of her narrow cot, with a fist pressed against her mouth so the night watch above would not hear. Written them on a scrap of parchment, read them back to herself, held the corner to her candle flame, and watched them curl to ash. Now, standing in the arched entrance to the great hall, with her traveling satchel on one shoulder and her resignation letter folded damp in her palm, she could not remember a single word. The hall was full. Of course it was full. Every noble house, from the western reaches to the River Selne, had packed into the vaulted room. Silk and fur and perfume, and the particular self-satisfaction of people who had never had cause to wonder whether they were wanted. Torch sconces blazed gold along walls of dark stone. Dried ivy had been braided between the iron chandeliers. A consort of musicians played from the minstrel gallery overhead, their lutes warm and celebratory in the thick air. And servants threaded through the crowd with trays of dark wine held steady as altars. At the far end of the hall, on the raised dais beneath the silver wolf crest of House Voss, stood King Aldric Voss. He looked magnificent. He always looked magnificent, and Maren had spent 6 years quietly hating him for it. Hated the way the ceremonial black surcoat sat across his shoulders, as though it had been made for the specific purpose of making him look like the last honest thing in the world. Hated the hard line of his jaw, and the way the torchlight found the dark copper in his hair. Hated most of all the way her chest pulled tight every time she looked at him. Even now, even here, even at the precise moment she had promised herself she would stop. Beside him stood Lady Isolde Vane, daughter of the Duke of Vane, fair-haired and composed, in the particular way of women trained since birth to make composure look effortless. Her hand rested on the king's arm, with the easy confidence of someone who had never had cause to doubt her welcome anywhere. Maren did not belong here. She had known it for 6 years. 6 years as the castle's keeper of records, buried 3 floors below the Great Hall in the vaulted document chambers that most of the court had never bothered to locate. 6 years cataloging treaties, grain assessments, territorial correspondence that no one read until they urgently needed it, at which point it was expected to materialize on the appropriate desk as though by divine arrangement. 6 years of being invisible to everyone who mattered, including the man she had been silently, stupidly, irrevocably in love with since the night he had carried her out of a burning river village when she was 18 years old. He did not remember that night. She was almost certain of it. He had pulled dozens of people from the flames along the banks of the Ashveil during the RiverClan raids. She was just another body slung over his shoulder, another life filed under duty performed in the ledger of a king who took such things seriously. But Maren remembered. She remembered the heat pressing through the walls of the apothecary where she had sheltered, the smoke filling her lungs like black water, and then a pair of arms closing around her from behind, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all. A voice, low and steady through the roar of collapsing timber. "I have you. Stay down." She had been a fool to build a life around 3 words, spoken by a man who would never say them to her again. The resignation letter was damp from the heat of her palm. A single line, its 3rd and final draft. "I hereby resign my position as Keeper of Records for Castle Duverne, effective immediately." Clean, irrefutable. Cowardly only in the specific sense that she was leaving it on a desk in an underground chamber where it might not be found for a week. She just needed to place the letter, walk out through the river gate, and disappear into the dark before anyone noticed she was gone. No one would notice. That was the whole point. Maren turned away from the hall and walked toward the stairs. The music swelled behind her. Bright, celebratory. The sound of joy that is only possible for people who have not spent 6 years watching someone they loved from a careful distance. Something inside her cracked along a line that had been thinning for 3 days. She kept walking. She descended 2 turns of the spiral stair, passed the iron gate, unlocked it with the heavy key at her belt, and entered the first vault chamber. The air shifted immediately, cooler, quieter, smelling of old vellum and candle wax and the mineral damp of the walls. She lit her desk candle, set the flame to steady, and placed the resignation letter precisely in the center of her writing surface. She stood there, just a moment. Her wolf stirred low in her chest, a keening vibration that moved through her ribs like the sound of a bell struck wrong. "I know," Maren whispered. Then she picked up her satchel and left. The river gate was unguarded. Every soul in the castle was at the ceremony. She stepped through the low archway into the night, and the air hit her face cold and sharp, carrying the smell of the Seln, dark water and river clay, and the distant green of the marshlands to the north. The torches of the wall flickered orange above her. Somewhere in the distance, a night heron called once and went silent. For the first time in 6 years, Maren took a breath that went all the way down. She made it 14 steps along the river path before the voice stopped her. "Miss Ashveil." She froze. Everett Crane, the king's chancellor, stood in the shadow of the gate arch, arms folded beneath his gray traveling cloak, watching her, with an expression she could not read even after 6 years of regular proximity to him. He looked at her the way he looked at documents he was not yet certain were genuine, thorough, patient, unimpressed by hurry. "Going somewhere?" he said. "I have resigned my position. I am free to leave." He studied her for a long moment. The river ran quietly below them. From far above and behind the stone walls came the muffled sound of music, still celebrating. Then, very quietly, "He is going to notice, you know." Maren almost laughed. The sound that came out instead was thinner and more honest than laughter. "No," she said, her voice barely holding its line. "He really is not." She turned and walked north along the river path, into the dark. Behind her, through the stone and the distance, the great hall of Castle Duverne erupted in cheering as the betrothal was announced. She did not look back. 3 days earlier, Maren had not been planning to leave. She had been planning to survive, the way she always did, quietly, invisibly, one catalogue document at a time. The vault was her kingdom. 3 vaulted chambers carved into the bedrock beneath the castle's east wing, connected by low corridors of dressed stone, every wall lined with shelves of dark oak, packed tight with the administrative memory of the Voss crown, stretching back 400 years. Treaties with the river clan confederacies, census rolls from the outlying farmsteads, correspondence between kings, between generals, between the long-dead lords whose decisions had made the present possible or impossible, depending on the question. Nobody came down here unless they had to. The spiral stair was steep, and the air at the bottom was cool year-round, in a way that discouraged casual visits. The light came from oil lamps and from a single, narrow window set high in the east wall that admitted a slice of gray sky in the mornings and darkness by mid-afternoon. The silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. She loved it. She loved the order of it, the way every document had a position, and every position had a logic. She loved that the work mattered even when no one acknowledged it. When the king needed the exact terms of the Seln River Compact before a negotiation, it was Maren who found it. When the chancellor required grain assessment figures for the last decade, it was Maren who compiled them, cross-referenced them against weather reports and trade ledgers, and had the summary on his desk before morning bells. She had never been thanked. Not once in 6 years. The documents appeared on the relevant desks as though placed by some invisible hand, and no one asked how they got there. What she had not stopped doing, despite every rational argument she had made to herself across 6 years and several dozen candlelit evenings of determined self-lecture, was watching the king. She watched him cross the outer ward each morning from her high, narrow window. She watched him in council when she was summoned to deliver records, always from the back of the room, always angling toward the door before he could scan the assembly and happen to notice the woman with the ink-stained fingers and the vault key at her belt. She watched the way he carried tension in the set of his jaw when negotiations turned badly, the way his hand moved through his hair in a gesture of private frustration that his face refused to show, the way he smiled, rare, reluctant, and so unexpectedly gentle when it finally came, at something his brother said, or when the elderly groundskeeper made some observation about the inner ward garden that clearly delighted him. 6 years of learning every expression, every habit, every tell. 6 years of loving a man who had looked through her so many times she had begun to wonder whether she was actually visible or merely present. There was a difference, she had decided. Furniture was present. People were visible. She had not been visible for a very long time. Then, 3 days before the betrothal announcement, the thing happened that broke her. Late afternoon, the kind of flat gray afternoon in early winter, when the light through the high window was already failing by the 4th bell. Maren had been summoned to the council chamber to deliver a set of river boundary surveys. She carried the rolled documents in the crook of her arm, climbed the east stair, knocked, entered, placed the surveys on the long oak table, and turned to leave. She walked directly into the king. He had been standing just inside the door, reading a dispatch, and she had trained herself never to look directly at him at close quarters. It was the only rule that kept her functional. The collision was graceless. She stumbled. The remaining documents scattered across the stone floor. She dropped immediately to her knees, reaching for the nearest fallen roll. "I am so sorry, Your Majesty. Forgive me. I did not." She reached for the last document at the same moment he crouched and reached for it too. Their fingers touched. Less than a second. The backs of his knuckles against the tips of her fingers over a rolled-up survey of the eastern tributary boundaries. A piece of vellum 11 years gathering dust. The jolt that moved through her body was not metaphorical. Physical, violent, immediate. Her wolf lunged forward inside her chest and slammed against her ribs with a force that stole her breath. A blow from the inside that left her unable to think. The recognition she had heard about her entire life passed in hushed voices between the castle's small community of changed blood in the servants' hall. This one belongs to you." She snatched her hand back and looked up. King Aldric Voss was looking directly at her. Not past her, not through her. At her face, with an expression she had never seen on him before. Something startled and searching, the look of a man who has heard a sound he cannot identify in a room he thought he knew. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice, low and close, and quiet enough that she could feel the warmth of it in the cold air between them. "Fine," she managed. "Perfectly fine, Your Majesty." She stood, clutched the remaining documents to her chest like armor, and left the room without looking back. In the stairwell, she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and stood very still. Her hands were shaking, not with embarrassment, not with the ordinary humiliation of having walked into the king in a doorway, but with something she recognized from every shifter account she had ever filed away. The bond. Reaching across the space between two people and saying, "Here is where you belong." But bonds were not one-sided. If she had felt it, he would have felt something too. And the look on his face, that brief, unguarded flash of confusion, meant he had. And he had let her walk away without another word. That night, Maren lay on her narrow cot and stared at the low, vaulted ceiling, while the truth settled over her like stone. He had felt the pull. She was certain. And he had chosen to set it aside because she was nobody. A vault keeper. A foundling who had appeared at the castle gates at 14 with a letter from a village priest, and a talent for organization that had eventually found its way underground. No family name that meant anything. No lands, no bloodline, no political weight. He needed Lady Isolde Vane and her father's river fleet and her family's control of the eastern trade routes. He did not need Maren Ashveil and her underground chambers full of old surveys. Fletcher Dunn, a senior man-at-arms who occasionally brought her a cup of warm broth when he was assigned to corridor watch, confirmed the betrothal announcement the same evening. He set the cup on the edge of her desk with the careful courtesy he always brought to her little kingdom, and stood for a moment before speaking. "It's official now," he told her quietly, watching her face. "Announcements in 3 days. Whole castle's invited." Maren wrapped her hands around the warm cup and smiled. "How lovely," she said, in a voice that came out exactly as she intended. Mild, pleasant, belonging to a woman to whom it did not especially matter. Something inside her, something that had held on through sheer, stubborn refusal to let go across 6 years, finally, quietly, snapped. She began writing her resignation letter that same night. The road north from Castle Duverne wound up through the chalk hillside for several hours before descending into the wide river basin farmland, stone-walled fields, and sleeping winter orchards stretching away on either side. She had planned her route with care. The town of Dunmore, 2 days' hard ride along the northern drove road, had an apothecary's house that also served as the district's herb physician. She had seen a notice in a trade correspondence ledger 6 months earlier and filed it away in the same careful part of her mind where she kept information she was not yet certain she would need. She had written ahead using her mother's surname and received a polite offer of a trial position as record keeper and herb sorter. It was not glamorous. But Dunmore was far enough north that she would never accidentally see a king crossing an inner ward at morning. That was sufficient. The first day of riding ran on adrenaline, the fierce, slightly giddy energy of having finally done the thing she should have done long before. She rode hard while the winter dawn came up gray and pink behind the hills, ate bread and dried apple from her satchel without stopping, made camp at nightfall in the shelter of a ruined sheepfold, and lay on her back watching the stars go sharp and cold overhead. She told herself she felt free. The second day was harder. The adrenaline faded around mid-morning, and what replaced it was a hollow, aching emptiness behind her sternum that grew with every mile she put between herself and the valley where the castle sat. Her wolf went quiet around noon. Not the quiet of rest, but the silence of an animal in pain. And it was that particular silence, more than anything else, that frightened her. She pushed on. She did not allow herself to stop and examine the feeling. The third morning, she could barely stand. The emptiness had become a physical pressure, a weight sitting behind her sternum that made her breathing labored and her hands unsteady when she tried to saddle her horse at first light. She stopped twice on the road into Dunmore, once to lean against a field boundary wall until the world stopped tilting, once to sit on the frozen verge, with both hands pressed flat against her chest. She arrived at the apothecary's house in the late afternoon, gray-faced and shaking, and smiling carefully, and presented herself to the herb physician as though none of it was happening at all. The vault's absence made itself known within 9 hours. Chancellor Everett Crane went below at the second bell of the following morning to retrieve an amendment to the Selne River Compact. He found the vault gate locked. He retrieved the duplicate key, returned, unlocked the gate, entered the first chamber, and found the single sheet of parchment lying precisely in the center of the writing table. He read it twice. Then he spent the better part of an hour searching for the amendment himself. He did not find it. Maren's organizational system, built entirely alone over 6 years, refined through 3 complete overhauls until it reached a state of such elegant precision that retrieving any document took her less than 2 minutes, was, to anyone who did not already understand it, an impenetrable forest of shelving units and coded markers and cross-reference indices written in her small, meticulous hand. Without her to navigate it, the shelves were simply shelves, covered in leather and vellum and mystery. By the afternoon council session, the disruption had spread. The quartermaster needed historical harvest yields from a vault section none of the clerks had ever entered. A correspondence regarding a border dispute with the Hillholds had been requested by the senior Lord Advisor and could not be located. 2 other councils had sent runners to the vault stair and returned empty-handed. "Where is the record-keeper?" Lord Aldous Petch, the oldest member of the council, finally asked. He said it the way one asks about a piece of furniture that has inexplicably stopped being where it belongs. "Gone," Everett replied. The word landed in the council chamber the way a stone lands in still water, the immediate drop and then the spreading circles of silence. "Gone where?" Lord Petch demanded. "She has resigned her post. I do not know where she has gone." Half the council had exchanged fewer than 10 words with Maren Ashveil in 6 years, but every single one of them had, at some point, received precisely the document they needed at precisely the moment they needed it, delivered without fanfare to their desk, as though the castle simply produced such things as a matter of course. At the head of the table, King Aldric Voss looked up from the report he had been reading. "Who resigned?" he asked. "Miss Ashveil, the keeper of records." Aldric's expression did not change in the way an expression does not change when a person is exercising deliberate effort to keep it from doing so. His pen stopped moving, his gaze fixed on the middle distance, not on any person present, but on some point of air before him, the way a man looks when he is reaching for a memory just past the edge of clear recall. "When?" he said. "3 days ago, the night of the betrothal announcement." Aldric went still, not merely quiet, still, in the particular way of a man whose body has received information that his mind has not yet finished processing. His free hand moved, almost without his appearing to notice, to press flat against the center of his chest. "The woman," he said slowly, "from the council passage. Dark hair, a ring of keys at her belt." Everett felt something move down his spine that was not quite cold and not quite warm. "You remember her?" "She walked into me." A frown, not the frown of a man irritated by information, but of a man unsettled by something he cannot name. His hand pressed harder against his chest. "She dropped her documents 3 days ago." "Yes." A long silence. His hand had not moved from his chest. His fingers spread wide over his sternum in a gesture of such private unconsciousness that it told Everett more than anything the king had yet said aloud. "Find her," Aldric said. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet, but there was something beneath the quiet this time, an undertow of urgency that did not correspond to the administrative inconvenience of a resigned record-keeper. "Your Majesty, she is well within her rights. I am aware of that," the jaw tightened. "Find her anyway." "May I ask why?" The king did not answer immediately. He pressed harder against his chest. When he looked up, Something moved across his face that Everett had never seen there in 14 years of service. Genuine confusion. Not the manageable uncertainty of a king navigating unclear intelligence. Actual, unsettled bewilderment at something happening inside his own body. "Because something is wrong," Aldric said, and his voice was rougher than it should have been for a man sitting calmly at a council table. "I cannot name it, but it started 3 days ago, and it is getting worse." Everett found her in 6 days. He arrived on a morning so gray it barely qualified as dawn, the frost still hard on the verge of the drove road. He located the apothecary's house by the bundles of dried herbs above the door and entered to the sound of a small bell and the smell of feverfew and dried meadowsweet. Maren was behind the workbench, sorting roots into clay jars. She looked up when he entered. The color left her face in the same moment recognition arrived. "Chancellor," she said. "Miss Ashveil." He looked at her steadily. "You are a remarkably difficult woman to find." She had not been wrong about that. She had used her mother's surname in the letter to the herb physician, and Everett had needed to work through 3 market town registers before the name appeared. But he had found her, and now she looked at him across the workbench with a composure that cost her something, though she was doing her best to conceal the cost. She looked terrible. Her cheeks were hollowed, her skin too pale. The shadows under her eyes the particular purple-gray of sleeplessness sustained over days. "You look unwell," he said. "I am adjusting." "To what?" She did not answer. "Why are you here, Chancellor?" Everett pulled out the stool on his side of the workbench and sat, uninvited, in the unhurried way he had learned to use on people he needed things from. He was in no hurry. That was almost never true, but he had learned to perform it regardless. "The document vault," he said, "is in a state I would describe as institutional crisis. The council cannot locate anything. We found your organizational notes in the left-hand drawer of your writing table. They are 43 pages long and reference a color-coded marker system you appear to have invented yourself, and not a soul in the castle can follow them." Something moved across Maren's face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, quickly suppressed. "I left detailed notes." "You left a document that requires another document to interpret." He paused. "But that is not why I am here." She looked at him. "Have you been experiencing physical symptoms since you left?" Everett asked, watching her carefully. "Fatigue, difficulty breathing, pain in the chest, a sensation of absence, as though something has been removed that was previously there." The question hit her the way he had expected, like something thrown from a direction she had not been guarding. Her mouth opened. Closed. She set down the root she was holding with a hand that was not entirely steady. "How did you know?" she whispered. "Because the king is experiencing the same thing." He held her gaze. 3 days after your departure, he collapsed during a training session in the lower ward. He has since reported insomnia, an inability to eat with any appetite, and a physical sensation he described to the castle's physician as, he glanced at his notes, "something pulled from the inside that I cannot find." Maren pressed one hand flat against the center of her chest. "The physician has concluded that an incomplete mate bond has formed, initiated through physical contact and never completed. The separation is causing both parties to deteriorate." He let that land. "She told me in plain terms, find whoever left or the king will not last the season." The small room was very quiet. Through the window, Dunmore was waking. Voices in the square, a cart on the cobbles. Maren stared at the clay jar in front of her for a long moment. "He is betrothed," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, clean and precise as a piece of ice breaking. "What exactly do you expect me to do?" "Come back. Allow us to find a solution before someone dies." The silence stretched. The fire in the small hearth ticked and shifted. Maren looked at the wall behind him with the particular expression of a person doing arithmetic they already know the answer to and dislike it. "If I come back," she said finally, her voice steadied, sharpened, I have conditions. Everett raised an eyebrow. You are hardly. I am in every position to negotiate. Not anger. Something older and harder and more certain than anger. You have just told me the king will die without me. That makes me the most important person in this castle at this particular moment, whether or not anyone knows my name. So, she folded her hands on the bench. He does not learn my name. He does not learn the nature of the bond. Not yet. I will return. I will be close enough to keep us both functional. But I will not be presented to a betrothed king as though I am a problem to be managed. Everett looked at her for a long moment. That will be difficult to arrange without raising questions. You are the chancellor, Maren said. Arrange it. He stood with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered fairly and does not particularly mind. Pack your things, Miss Ashveil. We ride at first light. After he left, Maren sat alone in the back room for a long time, her hands in her lap, not moving. The pressure behind her sternum, which had been grinding at her like a millstone for 6 days, had eased, slightly, at his mention of returning. As though some part of her knew, before the rest of her had agreed, that she was already going back. Her wolf stirred in the silence. Not frantic, not howling, just present, watchful, making a low sound that was not quite grief and not quite hope, but lived somewhere in the narrow space between them. I know, Maren whispered. She began to pack. Everett's solution was elegant and, Maren thought, faintly absurd. He installed her in a chamber on the upper servants' level, directly below the king's private quarters in the East Tower. Told the household staff she was a visiting document scholar from the monastery at Verith, temporarily assigned to assist with the castle's historical archive needs, and gave her a daily schedule designed to maximize proximity without direct contact. She would work in the small reading alcove adjacent to the council chamber during morning sessions. She would take her midday meal in the great kitchen during the same hour the king dined in the hall above. She would walk the inner ward at dusk, via the lower passage, not the main courtyard, while Aldric took his evening circuit of the upper ramparts. Always close, always just below. It was, Maren decided, as she unpacked her single satchel, the most elaborate game of hide-and-seek in the recorded history of Castle Duverne. But it worked. Within hours of returning, the crushing weight in her chest began to lift. By the following morning, she could breathe without thinking about it, a fact she had not appreciated the full significance of until it returned to her like a small miracle. The hollowness receded, the shaking in her hands stopped. Everett checked on her that evening, standing in her doorway with his arms folded, his expression careful. "Better?" he asked. "Better," she admitted. "The king slept 5 hours last night, the most he has managed in 10 days. He paused. He does not know why. Maren turned back to the stack of council documents she had been organizing. She had volunteered to begin restoring the vault's order, partly because it genuinely needed doing, and partly because she needed something to do with her hands at 3 in the morning. Someone had apparently attempted to sort the Seln boundary surveys by the color of their ribbon ties. Someone filed the River Compact amendments under R, she said. For River. Everett closed his eyes briefly. That would be Lord Petch's second clerk. River is not a subject. River is a geographical designation. The correct category is territorial negotiations, Eastern Basin. She paused. The clerk should not be permitted to file unsupervised. I will pass that along, Everett said, in the tone of a man who absolutely would not. The first week passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. She worked from the reading alcove, a low-ceilinged space divided from the council chamber by a single oak door that remained closed. She could hear him through it. His voice carried, low and measured, occasionally decisive in a way that cut through other voices, once or twice sharp with a frustration he kept short. She pressed her palm flat against the door once, only once, and felt the vibration of his voice moving through the wood, and her wolf surged so suddenly and strongly that she had to sit on the floor and breathe until it passed. "Stop it," she told herself. "You are medicine, not a person to him. He does not even know you are here." The bond did not care what she told herself. It never had. She felt him everywhere. Felt the precise moment he entered the east wing each morning. A warmth blooming behind her sternum like a second heartbeat, settling into sync with her own. Felt the moment he left at night, a cooling absence that made her pull her blanket tighter in the dark, even when the room was not cold. On the fourth day, she made a mistake. Deeply absorbed in cross-referencing territorial charters, she did not hear the oak door open. Aldric stood in the doorway, mid-sentence with someone behind him. She caught the tail of it, something about garrison reports. His hand on the doorframe, his attention still half-turned outward. But the moment he stepped through the opening, his body stopped. His head turned toward her, with the sharp, instinctive focus of something that has just caught a scent it recognizes. Their eyes met. The bond detonated. There was no softer word for it. A wave of heat moved through her from chest to fingertips, flooding her veins with the particular fire that she now recognized as the thing that had been missing for 6 days on the northern road, and that no amount of cold, rational thought had ever managed to fully dampen. Her wolf threw itself against her ribs with frantic force. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something almost visible. A tension running from his chest to hers, like a rope drawn taut. Aldric's hand dropped from the doorframe. His pupils were wide, his lips slightly parted, and he stared at her with an expression of such raw, completely unguarded shock that Maren felt it land in her bones. "You," he said, barely a breath. Behind him, an advisor appeared. "Your Majesty, is something the matter? Continue without me." His voice was perfectly steady, which struck her as nearly impossible given the pulse hammering in his throat. "I need a moment." The door swung shut, just the two of them, 6 feet apart, a room full of old charters and cold morning light, and the bond humming between them like a drawn bowstring. "You were in the passage," he said slowly. "Weeks ago. You dropped documents." "Yes." His eyes moved across her face with an intensity she had never been close enough to fully absorb. "Who are you?" "I am the document scholar, from Verith." "What is your name?" "It is not important, Your Majesty." He took a step toward her. The bond tightened. "What is your name?" Maren stood her ground, though every nerve in her was screaming either to close the distance or to run. "I am just the scholar." Another step. Close enough now that she could smell him. Wool and cold iron, and beneath that, something warm that made her wolf keen with a longing so acute it felt like grief. His hand came up slowly, hovering near her face, without touching, and she could see his fingers trembling. "Something is happening," he said, rough and low. "I can feel it." "Can you feel it?" Her eyes burned. Every part of her wanted to say, "Yes, I have felt it for 6 years. I felt it before you knew I existed." Instead, she stepped back, gathered her documents, and walked to the door. "I need to return to the vault," she said, and her voice only broke once, on the last word. She heard him say, "Wait," as the door closed behind her. In the corridor, she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and stood very still, breathing carefully, until her heart slowed enough to be manageable. 3 days of Maren restructuring her schedule to avoid the king. 3 days of Aldric, apparently, restructuring his to find her. He appeared in the reading alcove on the second morning. She heard the particular rhythm of his footsteps in the outer corridor. She had learned it years ago, tracking him at a distance, and her body remembered it before her mind had processed the sound. And she escaped through the servants' passage at the back, with an armful of charters and what remained of her composure. On the third morning, she could not escape in time. She spent 40 minutes pretending to organize a shelf while he sat at the reading table and pretended to review a report. The silence between them was deafening. charged with the constant low hum of the bond that neither acknowledged. She could feel his attention on the back of her neck, like a warm hand. She dropped 2 rolled charters. He cleared his throat 9 times. When she finally excused herself, her voice came out an octave too high, and she walked into the doorframe on the way out. "Are you all right?" he called after her. "Perfectly fine," she said from the corridor, pressing her forehead against the cool stone and dying quietly inside. Everett cornered her in the vault the following morning. "This is not working," he said without preamble. "I am aware." Maren did not look up from the charter she was cataloging. "He asks about you every day, more than once. He has taken to calling you the Verith Scholar." Everett paused, appearing to search for the correct word. "He says it with a kind of reverence that is beginning to concern the household staff." Maren looked up. "Reverence." "Yesterday he asked me what you prefer to eat in the mornings. I did not have an answer. He seemed dissatisfied." He sat down across from her. "The castle physician has recommended what she is calling daily proximity sessions. Extended time in the same space, shared air, shared warmth, to stabilize the bond without completed contact. It is not ideal, but it is preferable to the alternative." Maren thought about this. If the sessions stabilize him, the betrothal holds. He marries Lady Isolde, and She stopped. Everett said nothing. The candle between them guttered in a draught from the passage. "Tell him my name," Maren said at last, quietly. "Arrange the sessions. He will find out who I am eventually, and I would rather it came from you than from him cornering me in a corridor again." She paused. "He is not subtle." "No," Everett agreed. "He is not." That evening, Everett arranged the small reading room on the 2nd floor of the East Tower. A fire, 2 chairs, adequate candlelight. He told Aldric the document scholar's name before he left them alone. Maren arrived first and positioned herself in the chair farthest from the door, her back to the fire, a stack of work in her lap. When Aldric entered, the bond flared between them. Quieter than before, fuller, like a fire that has found sufficient air. He stopped just inside the door. His eyes found her immediately. "Maren Ashveil," he said. Her name in his mouth was not what she had imagined. She had imagined it often enough, his voice, her name, and none of those imagined versions had sounded like this, like a word he had been looking for. "Your Majesty," she managed. He crossed to the other chair and sat. The fire threw warm light across the planes of his face, and she watched him study her with the same focused attention she had spent years directing at him from the other side of various documents and doorways. There was something almost disorienting about being the object of it. "You kept the vault," he said, "for 6 years. Why did you leave?" She looked down at her work. "I had my reasons." "Everett tells me you left the night of the betrothal announcement." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, bringing him closer than the chairs required. Close enough that she felt the bond respond to the difference. "Was it because of me?" The directness of it stripped the breath from her. She looked up, and in his gray eyes she found something she had not expected. Not royal certainty, not the controlled authority he wore everywhere else, but something quieter and far more exposed. Fear. He was afraid of her answer. "No," she said. The lie came out clean. It was simply time for a change. She watched him choose to accept it, both of them knowing precisely what it was. He nodded, slowly, and looked into the fire. They sat in silence. Maren read, or appeared to read, turning pages at appropriate intervals. Aldric stared at the flames, and then his eyes closed, and then his breathing lengthened, and 20 minutes later, he was asleep. She watched him sleep. She watched the hard lines of his face soften, the tension in his shoulders that she had catalogued across 6 years of careful observation, releasing, degree by degree. until he looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally, reluctantly, been persuaded to set it down. "You beautiful, oblivious man," she thought. "I loved you before you knew my name, and you are going to marry someone else, and I am going to help you do it, because that is what you need. Because I have spent my entire life being what people need and pretending I need nothing myself." The fire burned low. Aldric slept on, peacefully, for the first time in weeks. The sessions became routine. Every evening, the same room, the same chairs. He fell asleep within the first hour without fail, his body surrendering to rest the moment it registered her presence, a reflex he made no effort to conceal. Slowly, in the evenings before sleep took him, the silence filled with something warmer. She told him about Mistress Aldwin, the elderly document keeper, who had discovered her sorting the castle's mislaid petition records at age 15, and quietly ensured she had a formal position before the year was out. She did not tell him about the River Village fires. Not yet. One evening he looked up from a report with an expression of careful amusement. "Someone told me," he said, "that you reorganized the spice stores in the East Kitchen." Maren did not look up. "The head cook came to me with a question about a historical provision order. I noticed the storage was inefficient." "She came to me," she said. He appeared to choose words. "That someone had rearranged everything and she can no longer locate the coriander." "Coriander is with the dried seeds. It has always been in the wrong section." "She had it with the warming spices." "That is not a category. That is a preference." Maren turned a page. "Categories are fixed. Preferences shift." He laughed, barely a sound, more breath than voice. But it changed his entire face, the hard lines dissolving, the gray eyes creasing at their corners. And something about it moved through Maren's chest like light through a narrow window. She had catalogued his smile from a distance for 6 years. Up close, it was worse. "You organize everything, don't you?" he said. "Not everything." She considered this genuinely. Feelings resist organization entirely. They pile up in no particular order and refuse to be indexed. His gaze settled on her face. "I think," he said quietly, "I know exactly what you mean." The air shifted between them. Maren looked away first. She always looked away first. It happened 3 weeks into the sessions. Aldric had fallen asleep in the usual way, and Maren had been working by candlelight for perhaps an hour when his breathing changed. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been open and relaxed in his lap, curled slowly into fists. A sound came from him, low and strained, not quite pain, not quite a word. Maren set down her work. She crossed to his chair and knelt beside it and took his hand. The moment her fingers closed around his, the world went dark. She was standing on a riverbank, and the river was on fire. Not the river, the village along its banks. The buildings to either side of the Ashfin's southern shore blazed with a cold, slow fire that moved in long, dreamlike pulses. Shapes moved within the burning. Faces she did not recognize, reaching hands, voices that were sound without word. And at the center of it stood a woman. She was ancient, bent near double, her face a ruin of old burns and older hatred, her eyes black as river-bottom mud. The crone of Ashven, the river clan's curse speaker, whose name Maren had encountered in a single old treaty correspondence, filed under Confederacy Relations, Southern Basin, Hostile. She had survived the raids, survived the wars, and laid her price before she left, not in coin, but in the particular currency of the unassuaged dead. "I wondered when you would come," the crone said. Her voice was dry as burnt parchment, carrying the cadences of the Eastern River speech. "Love is just another chain, child. Do you think you can pull him free of what he owes?" "You are feeding on his guilt," Maren said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "But guilt requires consent. It requires someone to agree they deserve it, and he does not have to agree." She moved through the slow fire toward him. Aldric stood ahead of her, and the fire burned around him in a circle that contracted with every pulse. She could feel what he felt through the bond, not regret, but guilt, specific and detailed and methodical. The guilt of a man who had counted every life lost and found his own survival included in the accounting as something that required justification. And then she saw herself, 18 years old, unconscious in the burning apothecary's house at the north end of the village street, and a younger version of the man beside her, ash-streaked, jaw set, pulling her from beneath a fallen beam and carrying her out through the smoke, his arms tight around her, his voice low and continuous through the roar. "Stay down, I have you. Stay down." The memory played in complete and devastating detail. She felt the weight of what he had carried that night, not just in his arms, but everywhere else. One life saved, measured against all those he had not reached. One rescue, filed under duty performed, while everything in him was still trying to run the numbers and make them add up differently. Maren stepped in front of him and put both hands on his face. "Look at me," she said. Not commanding, not pleading, simply speaking. "Right now. Look at me." His eyes found hers. In the dream they were very young, both of them, the age they had been that night, which felt like a lifetime and was barely 6 years. "I am standing in front of you," she said. "You carried me out of that fire, and I am alive, and I am here, and that is real. That is the only arithmetic that counts." Her hands were trembling, but her voice held. There is a difference between carrying grief and building a prison from it. This woman built that prison from her own grief and nailed the door from the outside, and you have been inside it for 6 years. For a long moment, nothing moved. The crone screamed, a sound like tearing cloth, and dissolved into ash and river fog. The fire began to dim. She woke, gasping on the stone floor beside his chair. The fire in the room had burned down to embers. The candles were low. Her hand was still gripping his. Aldric was awake. He was staring at her with an expression she had no language for. Open, stripped bare, every layer of composure he wore through the daylight hours simply gone, as though sleep and the dream had taken them off like a garment. "You were there," he said. His voice was rough, scratched raw. "At the Ashveil, 6 years ago. I carried you out." "Yes." The silence pressed down on the room like stone. He looked at their joined hands, his wrapped around hers, his thumb moving in an unconscious, slow arc across her knuckles. "You knew," he said. "This entire time, you have known." She could not speak past the thing that had closed in her throat. "Why did you never say anything?" "Because it did not matter," she said. And her voice broke precisely on the last word, in a way that made the lie very clear. His hand tightened around hers. "It matters," he said quietly. "You matter." The words landed in the center of her chest and opened something that had been sealed shut for 6 years. Maren pulled her hand free and stood on legs that barely held her. "I need to go," she whispered. Maren. Just her name. No title, no honorific. Raw and unadorned. Spoken like something he had needed to say for longer than he knew. She fled. In the corridor outside, she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, slid down to the floor, and cried. Not the careful, silent tears she had learned over the years, the kind she could produce without her face changing. The other kind. The kind that came from somewhere so deep she had forgotten it was there. He remembered her. He had always remembered, and it changed nothing. Because tomorrow, Lady Isolde Vane would be expecting her evening walk with the king along the ramparts, and the candles in the great hall would be lit for their shared supper, and everything would continue exactly as it had been arranged to continue. Lady Isolde Vane had arrived 10 days after Maren's return, with an escort of 30, 4 covered wagons, and the particular composure of a woman bred to expect a favorable reception everywhere she went. The outer ward had filled with the blue and silver of House Vane for the better part of an afternoon. Maren had watched from the high, narrow window of her document vault, 3 floors below. She watched Isolde descend from the lead wagon and extend her hand to Aldric, who took it with the formal grace of a king in public. She turned away from the window before she could see anything else. There was always work to do. The betrothal gifts required cataloging. The task had fallen to her, because no one else could produce a proper record, and she had done it with the same methodical care she applied to every document. Bolts of river silk, a matched pair of Vane-breed horses, an illuminated devotional, the lettering gilded by the finest scriptorium in the Eastern Territories. A tapestry depicting the Vane family's founding, 11 feet wide, in wool dyed 12 colors. She wrote each entry in steady, neat lettering. If her pen pressed a little harder than usual on certain words, there was no one there to notice. Then the evening session stopped. Everett informed her apologetically that the king's evenings were required for the formal courtship. Shared suppers, walks along the lower walls at dusk, entertainment arranged in the great hall. The rituals of a betrothal performed publicly for the assembled court. Maren nodded and said she understood. She did understand. That was the worst of it. Without the sessions, the bond began to change. The warmth behind her sternum cooled degree by degree, not breaking, but stretching, growing thin and tight like a thread under tension. Her sleep deteriorated into a cycle of waking every hour with her hand pressed against her chest, reaching in sleep for a heartbeat that was not there. She worked longer hours, reorganized sections of the vault that did not require reorganization, began a comprehensive new cross-reference index for the territorial boundaries, found that exhaustion was the only reliable path to sleep. Everett found her at 2 bells after midnight, surrounded by open ledgers, her candle barely a stub. "This cannot continue," he said from the doorway. "The cross-reference is nearly complete," she replied, without looking up. "I am not discussing the cross-reference." He came inside and closed the door. He looked genuinely tired in a way she had never seen from him. Not the controlled tiredness of a busy man, but something older and more honest than that. "The king is not sleeping again. His symptoms are returning. The physician says the bond is destabilizing." He paused. "I will speak plainly. If nothing changes, this will kill you both. Not quickly, but completely." The gravity of it settled over her cold and clear. She was not merely inconvenient. She was dangerous. If the Duke of Vane learned that the king had formed a mate bond with an unnamed document keeper of no family, the alliance would dissolve. Without the Vane River Fleet backing the crown, the Confederacy disputes that had been simmering for a year would find a match. She had read those files. She knew exactly what that meant, in bodies, and burned villages, and broken compacts. A document keeper with no name, and no land, and no title, quietly dismantling an Eastern alliance, simply by existing. She stared at the flame until it was very clear. She could not do this. She could not be his cure, and never his choice. She had spent 25 years giving people what they needed and pretending she needed nothing in return, and she was done. Done with all of it. If he wanted her, he had to choose her. And if he did not, if she was only ever medicine and proximity and the thing that kept the bond from killing him, she would leave again. Not for Dunmore. Somewhere he could not be fetched back from by a chancellor on a fast horse. She would leave properly, the way she should have left 6 years ago, before she had allowed herself to believe that proximity was the same as belonging. She dressed in the dark, her hands steady in a way they had not been in weeks. She did not take the servants' passage. She walked through the castle's main corridor, up the great stair in the east wing, past 2 men-at-arms who looked at her and did not move to stop her. Possibly because something in her expression made it clear that stopping her would be a poor use of their evening. She reached the door to the king's private chamber at the top of the east tower and knocked once, hard. The door opened. Aldric looked terrible. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened to the particular bruised purple of a man who has not truly slept in days. His face was hollow in the torchlight, his skin pallid above the collar of a shirt, untucked and barely fastened. He was still dressed, which meant he had not gone to bed, which meant he had been awake at whatever hour this was when she had knocked on his door. When he saw her, the expression behind his eyes cracked open, something beneath the surface of his careful control simply giving way, the way ice gives way in early spring, sudden, quiet, and complete. "Maren," he said. The word came out as something close to relief. The bond roared between them, heat flooding through her from the base of her spine to the crown of her head, her wolf surging forward with a sound that was half grief and half homecoming. She could feel his heartbeat in her own chest, rapid, desperate, reaching. "I need to tell you something," she said. He stepped back from the door. She walked past him into the chamber, a large room with a low-burning fire and a carved oak bed and windows looking out over the dark outer ward, and turned to face him. "6 years ago," she began, "there was a fire at a river village on the southern Ashveil during the Confederation raids. I was 18 years old. I was sheltering in the apothecary's house on the North Street when the building caught. You carried me out." She held his gaze. "I know you remember that night. I have been inside your dreams, through the bond, and I have seen what it costs you. I know you carry it the way you carry everything, carefully, and alone, and in silence." Aldric had gone very still. "I came to work at Castle Duvernay because it was the only position available to a young woman with no family name and a letter from a village priest. But I stayed because of you. I stayed for 6 years because every morning I could watch you cross the ward from my window, and every time I delivered documents to the council I could hear your voice, and that was enough." Her voice wavered but did not stop. "I resigned because you became betrothed to someone else, and I could not bear to watch it from 3 floors below. And then your chancellor told me you were dying, because of a bond that had formed between us. A bond I had felt the moment our hands touched in the council passage, and that you had felt too. And I came back." She paused. "Not because I was asked to. Because I would rather be near you and in pain than be far from you and merely hollow. And I am tired of pretending I do not need anything. I am tired of being the medicine that keeps everything running so other people can live the lives they want." She met his eyes. "I love you. I have loved you since I was 18 years old. And I am done being quiet about it." The silence that fell was so complete, she could hear the fire. Aldric looked at her. Every line of his face, every breath, was still and attentive and utterly without the usual armor of kingship. He looked at her the way she imagined she had been looking at him for 6 years, like she was the only fixed point in the room. "The Sessions," he said slowly. "The scholar from Verith. The woman who made me sleep." Something moved in his gray eyes. "That was always you." "Yes." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were bright with something he did not try to conceal. "I felt it," he said. "In the council passage, when our hands touched. I felt it and I did not have a name for it. And then you were gone, and everything stopped working, and I thought I was losing my mind." His jaw was tight. "I should have followed you immediately. I should have known who you were long before that moment. I should have—" He crossed the room in 3 steps. His hands came up to frame her face. Careful, deliberate, the way you hold something you have just realized you nearly lost. And the contact sent a shock through both of them that she felt to the bone. His emotions came through the bond like a flood breaking a dam. Anguish, wonder, fury directed entirely at himself. And beneath all of it, something steady and deep, and more certain than any of the rest. "You are seeing me now," Maren said. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was 6 years of silence and distance and denial, collapsing into a single point of contact, urgent and searching, and desperately careful, all at once. Her hands fisted in his shirt. The bond blazed between them. Not the thin, stretched, aching tension of the past weeks, but something alive and complete, like a flame that has finally found the fuel it was made for. She felt it happen, the bond completing. A click, a key in a lock, a sound below sound, and the warmth that flooded through her in the aftermath was golden and permanent, and altogether unlike anything she had a word for. Aldric pulled back just far enough to look at her. "The betrothal," she started, "is over. Immediate and absolute. It was over the moment I knew your name. I will not marry a woman I have no bond with while my mate has been standing 3 floors below me for 6 years. Invisible, because I was too busy being a king to pay attention." His voice was rough with something that had nothing to do with authority. "Mine, if you will have me. All of it, whatever that means from here." She pulled him back down and kissed him instead of answering. The answer was in it. He understood. They slept that night with her head against his shoulder, his arm across her waist, the bond humming between them, in the particular warm steadiness of a thing finally completed. Then his breathing changed. She recognized it immediately. The shift from rest to the territory of the nightmare. The almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. She sat up in the dark and took his hand, and let the bond pull her under. The fire was worse this time. It surrounded him on all sides, taller and hotter than before, and at its center stood the crone of Ashveil. Maren had encountered her only once, in the dream 3 weeks ago, glimpsed briefly at the dream's edge before the fire dimmed. Now she saw her fully, ancient, bent double, her face a ruin of old burns and older hatred, her eyes black as river-bottom mud. The curse speaker had survived everything. She had been surviving, Maren suspected, on exactly this. The flames reached toward Maren the moment she arrived. She felt, briefly, the old terror. 18 years old, the heat through the walls, the smoke filling the room like black water. She felt it, and she recognized it for what it was. A weapon. And a borrowed one. "You think love is enough," the crone said. Her voice was ancient and dry. "I have watched love rot into guilt before. I have made a long meal of it." "You built a prison from your grief," Maren said, moving through the slow fire toward Aldric, "and you nailed the door from the outside. And he has been inside it for 6 years because he was kind enough, and guilty enough, to walk in and stay." She stepped in front of the crone and looked directly into those black eyes. "But he is not alone in there anymore." She turned to Aldric and put both hands on his face. "I was left on the steps of a church in midwinter," she said, and saying it out loud, here, where he could hear it, cost something, but she gave the cost freely. "I have spent my entire life trying to be useful enough that no one would find a reason to send me away. I believed, for a very long time, that I was only worth keeping if I was worth something to someone." She swallowed. "I was wrong. I was worth wanting the whole time. I simply did not know how to believe it." Her hands were trembling, but her voice held. "And so are you. You are worth keeping because you exist, not because of what you can carry. And I am telling you, you have carried this long enough." His exhale moved through his whole frame. She held on. She did not tell him to let go. She had learned that telling someone to let go was useless. Instead, she simply held on and kept holding on. And eventually, the shaking stilled. The crone screamed, a sound like tearing cloth, and dissolved into ash and river fog, unmade by the particular thing she had never accounted for. Grief that had been met with witness rather than silence. Aldric collapsed forward into her arms and wept. Not the controlled emotion of a man performing grief, but the kind of crying that happens when something sealed for too long is finally opened. She held him without speaking, her arms firm and steady, her chin resting on the crown of his head. "I have you," she thought. "Stay down." He felt it. She knew he did. The bond carried everything now, in both directions. They woke with the gray light of early morning coming through the east-facing windows, foreheads touching, hands still interlaced, the bond between them warm and even and entirely steady. Aldric opened his eyes and looked at her. There were no shadows in his gaze. For the first time in as long as she had been watching him, there were simply no shadows. "Stay," he said. Maren smiled. "Where would I go?" The Duke of Vane was furious. This was expected. Everett managed him with a particular combination of patience and immovability that had served 3 successive kings, and within a month, a new trade agreement had been reached, one that gave House Vane preferential access to the castle's river route trading licenses, which cost the crown very little, it was not prepared to give. The Duke's fleet of river barges was, it turned out, more interested in commerce than in matrimony. Lady Isolde herself was less predictable. She found Maren in the East Corridor 2 days after the announcement, stepped into her path with the directness of a woman accustomed to getting the attention she required, and studied her with calm, intelligent eyes. "You are the one," she said, not a question. "Lady Isolde." Maren braced herself. "I am sorry. Do not apologize." Isolde looked at her steadily. "I spent 4 weeks attempting to hold a conversation with that man that was not about river compacts or garrison supply, and I never managed it once. If you can make him sleep and make him laugh." A brief pause, something almost dry moving across her composed features. "Then you are exactly where you ought to be." She extended her hand with a briskness that brooked no sentimentality. "I intend to find someone who looks at me the way he looks at you. I hope you are both very happy." Maren took her hand, startled and unexpectedly grateful. The court's reception was more complicated. A document keeper of no family name and no title as the king's mate was not what the castle's nobility had imagined for their Alpha King. The whispers followed Maren through every corridor for weeks. Some days she heard them more clearly than others, and some of those days were harder than she let on. But Aldric never wavered. He introduced her to the assembled court at a formal hall session, her hand in his voice carrying the quiet absolute authority she had long recognized as his version of, "This is not open for debate." He looked at no one but her when he said her name, and what was in his face when he said it was something that even the most skeptical lord in the room understood without requiring translation. She kept the vault. Everett offered her a title, a proper chamber on the noble floor, a wardrobe fitting for a queen-to-be. Maren accepted the chamber. Sleeping next to Aldric had stopped being an option and become a necessity, for both of them, and declined everything else. "I will take a title when I have earned it, in a way that means something to me," she told Everett. Everett looked at Aldric. Aldric lifted one shoulder with the expression of a man who had recently and rapidly learned which particular battles were entirely unwinnable, and had made a considered decision to stop fighting them. Fletcher Dunn, stationed to corridor watch outside the vault stair the morning after the announcement, set a cup of warm broth on the edge of her writing table with the careful courtesy he always brought to her little kingdom. "Congratulations, then," he said, and smiled at the wall, because he was that kind of man. "Thank you, Fletcher," she said. The nightmares did not vanish all at once. Healing rarely moved in straight lines. Some nights, Aldric woke with his hands clenched and his heart hammering, the ghost of smoke in his lungs, the faces he had memorized swimming back up from wherever he had managed to keep them through the daylight hours. On those nights, Maren held him and talked, not about the fires, not about grief, not about any of the things that would pull him deeper in. She talked about the clerk who had spent 2 days attempting to refile a century of tax records in alphabetical order by the second word of each title, because he had thought it would be more specific. About the heron she had seen on the Sound that morning, that had caught a fish nearly as large as itself and seemed genuinely surprised by this development. About the head cook's ongoing principled refusal to acknowledge that the spice stores were now correctly organized, which Maren had concluded was a matter of personal honor and not worth engaging. He laughed sometimes. Quiet, exhausted, genuine laughter that vibrated against her collarbone and settled something in her chest she had no word for other than right. Better days came more frequently. The fire in his dreams burned lower each time she brought him back from it. The accounting he had kept for 6 years, the names, the faces, the numbers that would not balance, did not disappear, but it lost its power to pull him under. He was learning to carry it differently, not to set it down, but to hold it in a way that left his hands free for other things. Many months later, on a morning so ordinary it felt like its own small miracle, Maren woke to pale winter sunlight through the east windows and the steady rhythm of Aldric's breathing beside her. His arm was across her waist. His face, turned toward hers, was soft and still in sleep. The hard lines that were so much a part of him in waking, almost entirely absent. No shadows beneath his eyes, just the silver threads beginning at his temples that told the story of a burden carried longer than was fair, and the faint scar along his left brow from some old training injury she had noticed 3 weeks into the reading sessions and never asked about. She lay still for a while and let herself simply be here. She thought about the strange and circuitous path that had brought them to this morning. She had walked away. He had come undone. And somehow, impossibly, that had been the beginning, not of what they should have had, but of what they actually were. She pressed a kiss to his shoulder, quiet and unhurried. His arm tightened across her waist in sleep, not waking, just pulling her closer by reflex, instinctive and certain. The gesture of a man whose body had learned where it belonged. She smiled into the warm wool of his shirt and closed her eyes. Below the window, the outer ward was waking. She could hear it. The soft voices of the early kitchen workers, the sound of the gate being drawn back for the morning's first deliveries, the particular scrape of iron-rimmed wheels on cobbles that meant the bread cart from the lower village. Somewhere close, a bird was singing in the single elm tree that grew against the east wall. The same tree she had watched every morning for 6 years, from 3 floors below, through a narrow window that barely let in the sky. She was not 3 floors below anymore. She was not invisible anymore. She never would be again.